Here's a picture of my children, taken some 20 years ago. They're my pride and joy. This captured moment captures them as the little cherubs they wore. But yet when bedtime would come around and it was time for them to pack it in, our little cherubs would transform into weepy, inconsolable puddles. I see that perhaps some of you can relate. This nightly pattern continued until we were utterly exasperated. Then one night, I did what any good dad would do. I sat them down and said, "Kids, we need to have a talk." And I shared with them this meticulously crafted slide deck about the importance of getting a good night's sleep, the virtues of good sleep hygiene for children. I went through all the benefits of getting a good night's sleep and why they needed to go to bed when mommy and daddy told them so. They learned the errors of their ways, and they went to bed with a smile and gave me a hug and said, "Thanks, Dad." Okay, if it's not painfully obvious by now, clearly I'm kidding about this fantastical approach that we took. But can you imagine how that would have gone down had I attempted that? Here's the approach we actually took. Instead of telling our kids it's time to go to bed, we began to ask them, "What book would you like to read at bedtime?" That small shift transformed our bedtime from one of abject terror to one of delight. We learned from our success on that front. And it fundamentally transformed the way we parented. You see, kids want to have agency, to have a voice. They don't like it when things are done to them. Seems pretty obvious in hindsight when you're not in a sleep-deprived stupor, right? But I share this with you today because the reality is we don't outgrow this deep-seated desire as adults. Consider for a moment when you go out to dinner and your server delicately places your beautifully prepared plate and says emphatically, "Be very careful, don't touch that plate, it's extremely hot." And what's the first thing we all do the moment they turn their back? We think to ourselves, well, we'll just see about that, as we proceed to touch the plate only to receive third-degree burns on our fingertips. We are wired for agency. We want to have a voice in our socially constructed world. And yet, I can't count the number of times that I've encountered leaders who share the figurative pitch deck, or sometimes even the literal ones, extolling the virtues of whatever vision they're about to impose upon us and why we ought to get on board. Just like the one I shared a moment ago, joking with my kids. It was ridiculous in that context, and it's equally ridiculous at work. In my 2+ decades of working with leaders across 6 continents, here's what I've learned. These principles are universal. Good leadership transcends boundaries and cultures. Whether you're leading a startup or a global enterprise or a local business right here in Northampton, the fundamental truth remains the same. People want agency. And that doesn't change just because we've clocked into work. So what are the implications for organizational leaders? As leaders, we often take this flawed approach to change. We craft the perfect strategy. We spend weeks or months developing the plan. We create these elaborate communications to articulate that strategy. Then we roll them out to our teams with great enthusiasm and gusto, only to have them received with crickets. Or worse, resistance or even outright active sabotage. And then we're left wondering, what happened? Why don't they see the benefits of this? Why aren't they getting on board? I couldn't have communicated this any more clearly. As leaders, we've been taught that good leaders should have all the answers. They should set that vision and then inspire their teams to follow. That's the leadership model that most of us learned. But I'm here to tell you that it's ineffective, it's exhausting, and frankly, it's a myth. Because here's what the research shows. People support what they help create. Let me tell you what researchers at Harvard, Tulane, and Duke universities discovered. They call it the IKEA effect. They asked people to install IKEA furniture. You know, all those boxes with the cryptic instructions and the extra screws you never quite know what to do with. And then they asked them, how much were they willing to pay for this item that they had just assembled? And here's what they found. People were willing to pay more for an item they assembled versus a pre-assembled item that was exactly the same. In fact, 63% more for the exact same item. Now that sounds crazy, right? Why is that? It's because we're neurologically wired to overvalue our own creations. When we have a part in building something, we develop an emotional attachment to it. We value it more. We become invested in its success. So, what are the implications then for organizational change? As leaders, when we hand down a predefined vision, the team is being asked to implement something they had no part in creating. And then we wonder why they're not excited about it. But if we instead invite the team to co-create that future with us, something remarkable happens. People don't just buy in. They build in. They own it. They become committed to its success. Because the future doesn't unfold through one person's brilliance. It unfolds through those small moments of invitations from leaders who invite their team to co-author what comes next. Let me share a story that illustrates this. I once worked with a marketing firm that was facing insolvency. They had just lost one of their major clients. In fact, it was their biggest one. They had already had to let several of their talented team members go. And they had just a few months before the cash would run out and they would have to close down. The executive team was in crisis mode. They weren't quite sure what to do. They had spent weeks developing a plan. They had a strategy that they came up with. They had the numbers. They even had a deck ready to go. But then they paused and asked themselves, what if we don't present this plan? What if instead we ask the team to help us figure it out? Frankly, it felt risky. They felt as if they were running out of time. Surely it would be quicker to just tell people what needed to happen, right? It also felt incredibly vulnerable. But they nonetheless chose to co-create the plan. They called an all-hands meeting. They shared with full transparency their financials and the dire situation that they were in. And then they said something that leaders rarely say. We don't have all the answers. We need your help. How can we solve this together? What happened over the course of the day in that workshop defied their expectations. The team didn't just come up with solutions. They came up with better solutions that leadership would have never envisioned, because those closest to the work can often see opportunities that leaders can't from 30,000 feet. They identified new potential revenue opportunities and business development strategies. They identified potential product innovations. They found cost reduction efficiencies that the leadership team hadn't even considered. But most importantly, they generated something else. Commitment. That company didn't just survive, they're thriving today. Not because the leaders had all the answers, but because they created the space for better solutions to emerge collectively. Now, I'm sure that some of you are probably thinking, well, that sounds nice, but I don't have time for endless meetings and consensus building. Well, the good news is that this approach actually takes less time in the long run, not more. It's important to note also that this is not about being soft or democratic. It's not about having everyone vote on everything. It's about being targeted and strategic. When you invite folks in, it can understandably be scary because you have to relinquish some control as a leader that you might not otherwise do so to those that don't have that formal leadership role. But the potential upsides are well worth the risk. Because the future does not unfold through one person's brilliant vision. It unfolds through those small moments of invitation. And when you can make this shift, when you choose to ask instead of tell, to invite instead of dictate, you don't just get better strategies. You get teams that are genuinely committed to making those succeed. You don't just get execution. You get innovation. You don't just get compliance. You get commitment. But perhaps most importantly, you create workplaces where people feel seen, heard, and valued, and able to do their best work in service of something meaningful. That's how thriving futures are created together. Let me share a story about one of my clients that used this to transform their work together. There are 3 steps that I want to share with you in terms of how they embodied this. And the first is to set clear boundaries. Be explicit about what's negotiable and what's not. Perhaps the budget's fixed. Maybe the deadline's set. Maybe there are key elements of your strategy that are mandatory. That's fine. Just be explicit about what those are up front. But within those boundaries, allow genuine space for people to create those solutions. Second, use those structured processes. Again, this isn't about brainstorming free-for-alls. Effective co-creation uses both what's called divergent thinking, where you generate those ideas and possibilities, but also convergent thinking, where you make decisions and take clear actions. This client that I told you about, they were an energy company. They used this to transform their work. While they started as a creative startup, increasing market complexities and regulatory compliance constraints caused them to add layers of bureaucracy over the years. Innovation had stalled. Employee engagement was low. People were going through the motions and many were headed for the exits. But the leadership team, instead of coming up with a transformation plan in the boardroom, brought together over 70 employees through the course of a large-scale summit over 3 days. Not to hand them a transformation plan, but to co-create that together. They had the structure. They had clear objectives. They had those boundaries. But within those boundaries, they allowed for genuine space to create that. The result? They collectively envisioned a new future together. The teams came up with 6 key strategies or initiatives to realize that as part of their 3-year strategy. They pressure tested those in real time. They came up with cross-functional ownership and action plans that they genuinely bought into. Ultimately, they've reignited that entrepreneurial spirit that had been lost. Employee engagement was reinvigorated. Innovation sparked. And ultimately, performance was enhanced. And that brings me to the third and most important point, and that is engaging people authentically. Not to rubber stamp your ideas. Not to give feedback on predetermined decisions. We've all been party to that, I'm sure. But to engage them authentically. And when you do so, you create these powerful futures together. In my 2+ decades of advising executives through transformation, what I've learned is this. The leaders that make the biggest impact aren't the ones with the loudest voices or the most charismatic presentations. They're the ones that create space for other voices to be heard. They're the ones that understand that sustainable change doesn't come from one person's brilliance. It comes from collective wisdom and joint ownership. When you make that shift, again, when you ask instead of tell, you create this vibrant future together. So here's my invitation to you. The next time you're tempted to roll out a vision for a particular decision or for a particular vision or an idea or a strategy that you have, whether it's at work, in your community organization, or even at home, pause and ask yourself, who needs to help create this? Then invite them in, not as a formality, not to check the box, but genuinely. And ask them this question. Before I share my thoughts, what do you see as our biggest opportunity here? The metaphorical, what story should we read together at bedtime? That small shift, that small moment of invitation, that's how unfolding futures are created together. Because the best visions aren't sold from top down. They're created with the very people that must bring them to life. And who knows, perhaps this will transform more than just your strategy. Perhaps it will transform your bedtime routine too. Thank you.